welcome everybody to this exciting evening of science. I'm Walter Lucchesi and I will be the host, and I will also take some of your questions. So but you can put it on the chat, and also, as Ken said, at the end, we can do by raising the hands. And so, which surely there will be a lot of them, because it's going to be a pleasure to listen to Dr. Steve Portugal, which I'm lucky to have as a colleague at Royal Holloway University of London, where he's a reader in animal behavior and physiology. Steve is a comparative ecophysiologist, researching at the interface of physiology, sensory ecology, and behavior of vertebrates, with more than 70 publications on bioenergetics, adaptation to extreme conditions, flight and vision, and what he calls the biomechanics of weird things. So his research basically is of how animals adapt their behavior to changes in the ecology and the ecosystem, which is incredibly timely and relevant in this moment of global environmental change and exploitation of natural resources. So as a cherry on the cake, I would say that Steve has also given his scientific support to radio and TV program, including one that I love particularly, which is the Life in the Air, which is an absolute gem. And so without further ado, I would say I would introduce Steve to take us through this talk that he calls The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, who is really benefiting from traveling in groups. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much, Walter, for that introduction. And just give me 2 seconds to make sure that my talk is going to load and behave. Perfect. Thank you very much. Oh, good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here today. I love talking about exciting animals, exciting behavior, exciting physiology. And this is sort of a collection of research that I've been working on for about 8 or 9 years now. And it's all to do with how animals travel in groups. And the questions I'm interested in are, who decides where to go? Whether it's just a short flight across a lake, for example, in a flock of geese, which individual suddenly decides now's the time to go, and which individuals follow them, and why do they follow them? And looking at a larger scale, when you're talking about migrations that could be 10, 15, 20,000 kilometers, these animals are traveling in groups, and who's deciding where to go? Who knows where to go? Who wants to lead? Who's happy to be a follower? And what are the energetic implications of where you're positioned within this group while you're on the move? So I'm very interested in what happens when animals come together, and specifically, what happens when they need to get on the move, when they need to go somewhere. And we know that animals come together for a variety of reasons. It can be, for example, protection against predation. By being in a group, we have what's called the predator confusion effect. You're kind of hoping, like you can see with these sharks in the middle there, and this fish bait ball up on the top there, that by being as a large group, you can confuse the predator to the point where the predator can't focus on a single individual. You're basically overwhelming them. You can also have this effect that we call predator swamping, that basically the predators just eat so much of this prey item that they simply can't manage anymore. So the rest of the individuals can go about their business without being bothered. You can also act collectively, like these terns are in the middle, as a group to mob potential predators, to force them away from your nest site, for example. We also have what's called the dilution effect. You're secretly hoping that if you're surrounded by loads of other individuals of your species, and there's a predator event, that someone else is going to get eaten, not you. So it's really quite a selfish perspective. You can also share vigilance, like these widgeons are at the bottom, these ducks that come out and graze on grass. And like the emperor penguins do, you can live as a group for thermoregulatory reasons. So the only way these male penguins survive the Antarctic winter while they're incubating is through huddling to conserve energy. So the system that I'm particularly interested in are birds. And that's because I find birds really dynamic. Now, if you think about a herd of cows that are in a field, and they're thinking about maybe moving to the other side of the field, they can all stand there, they can stay still, they can stare at each other, they can have a moo at each other, they can figure out what the plan is and move slowly away. However, if you're a bird and you're supporting your own body up there in the sky, you cannot stop and have a chat with your flockmates. The second you slow down below a critical speed, you stall and you fall out the sky. So everything that's happening for birds as they're traveling has to happen quickly. Collisions are often fatal, or at least make you very easy to be predated upon. So they present a really dynamic system because of the speed at which these decisions are having to be made. Now, when birds come together in groups, they typically form two distinct types of flock shapes. And we call that cluster flocking, which is a bit of a mouthful, or V-formation flocking. And what seems to determine what type of flock these birds travel in is how big they are. So any bird that's larger than a black-headed gull will tend to travel in a V formation, and any bird that's smaller than a black-headed gull, like for example starlings and the songbirds we see in our gardens, they tend to travel as a cluster. So you have these two interesting and different systems, how birds are traveling when they're on the move. And today I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the work I've been doing on V formation. And I mentioned that it's size that's really determining what kind of flock shape that birds fly in. And the bigger birds are those which are flying in V formation. And this is because they're not very maneuverable. When you look at these fantastic images of these common cranes flying above Venice, they look majestic. They can fly very fast in a straight line, but their turning circle is akin to that of a jumbo jet. They are not going to be performing amazingly intricate aerodynamic feats of whirling and swirling and twirling. It simply won't work. So the size means they're flying in a V formation and they're flying in a nice structure, fast and in a straight line. They're not doing lots of exciting whirling and various things like that. And we've been fascinated by V formation for a very, very long time. And the typical ideas for what's been suggested for why birds fly in a V formation typically fall under four categories. One is it's a great way of keeping in visual contact with your flockmates. So if you want to keep traveling with these individuals, if you're in a big swirling mess, actually you'll lose them. It's quite hard to keep track of a certain individual. And it's thought that those birds which fly in a V formation are doing so perhaps to maintain some visual contact with their flockmates. Another idea is that the bird at the front has superior navigational knowledge. So you're following that old goose or that old crane because they know where they're going. They've done this journey many times. Another reason, as I've already mentioned, this idea of it helps against predation. If there's going to be an attack, hopefully it's someone else, not me. But the idea that's really persisted for centuries, and the idea that certainly captured my imagination, is this idea there's an energetic saving for birds who are flying in a V formation. And it's this idea that's persisted, and it's this idea that I've spent probably too much time exploring and investigating. And I mentioned that this idea has been around a long time. So you can go way back to AD 23 in Rome, when Pliny said, like fast galleys cleaving the air more easily than if they drove at it with a straight front. So even back then, he was alluding to the idea that flying in a V formation had benefits that meant that individuals weren't working as hard. And you have to bear in mind that at this time, most of Western Europe, and certainly if you go back to ancient English texts, we thought that migratory birds, when they disappeared from our view, were living at the bottom of riverbeds, for example, or in fact with barnacle geese were actually crawling inside shells. So this was an incredibly forward-thinking approach when the rest of us were kind of, one could say, in the dark a little bit. And the reason that this idea persisted, and the reason that it makes sense that there could be some benefit to flying in a V formation is because of what you're looking at here. And what you can see here on a variety of planes are what we call wingtip vortices. Now, when an object like a plane or a bird, or even if you're throwing a ball through the air, as it travels through the air, naturally, it has to make room for itself. And it does that by pushing the air out the way and by pushing the air typically downwards. So as a plane is moving forward through the air, it's pushing the air out the way and it's pushing it down beneath it. Now, whilst most of that air is pushed down beneath the aeroplane, a little bit of it travels along the wing and comes off the wingtip. And we call that a wingtip vortices. And that's what you can see being left behind in these planes. Now, this wingtip vortex that comes off the tip of the wings actually could provide some lift for the other individuals. However, the air coming down, being pushed down as it moves through the air, is bad. You don't want to get caught in that. And it's this downwash, or this wake as it's occasionally referred to, that dominates or dictates the distance or the time gap between planes taking off and landing at airports. So if you're stood at Heathrow for a long time waiting for something, the big plane takes off, there's a bigger gap before the next plane can. If it's a smaller plane, there's a smaller gap because the amount of air being pushed out the way is less for a smaller object. Now, NASA have kindly put together this video which shows a wingtip vortex through smoke plumes. And you can see here, it's actually a passenger plane, but not with passengers on. As it flies through those smoke plumes, you can see these vortexes. And now you have to imagine this is happening continuously. As any bird or aeroplane moves through the air, that effect is continuous. So these vortices are constantly being created. And very clever physicists and aerodynamicists, if that's a word, and engineers, they spent decades trying to study the maths, physics, and aerodynamics between the potential aerodynamic interactions that were taking place between individuals in a V formation. And they went into an insane amount of detail. For example, they were constantly using very complicated modeling and mathematics to say, well, they should actually position themselves here. They should be at a 60-degree angle out. They should be 5 meters back to take advantage of this upwash. So the thing to keep at the back of your head is the wingtip, the vortex coming off the wingtip is called upwash, and that's good. The air being pushed down beneath the bird is downwash, and that's bad. So wingtip air, good. Body air, bad. And this is what these people spent a very long time trying to figure out. There was one problem with the approach they were adopting, though. They were applying what we call fixed-wing aerodynamic theory, i.e. aeroplanes, and they were taking that and applying it to birds. Now, most birds flap their wings between 5 and 7 times a second. And that doesn't include hummingbirds who are off the chart on a whole new level. So taking this approach and forcing it on birds who are flapping their wings turns out didn't really work very well. It wasn't very insightful. Now, helpfully, the Discovery Channel made a nice animation if you're struggling to picture it. Here we have a bird, it's flying through the air. This upwash comes off the wingtip in the red there. And another individual can have an easier life by positioning itself in that red, in that upwash, and getting a little uplift and a little bit of help. So my interest in this was understanding what was going on between members of a flock. Where did they position themselves? How hard were they working? How did they know where to be? How much did they move around? Now, of course, a reasonable question would be, why would anyone care? Why do we care how birds fly in a V formation? What on earth can it do for us? Now, apart from the intrinsic interest for me as a scientist, the applications are actually quite extensive. And that's the reason that many countries, the aeronautic industry and NASA, have been studying V formation flight in great detail. Basically, they want to recreate V formation flight in the future with passenger planes. Now, when you see, for example, during World War II, or any sort of military exercise, when you see planes flying in a V formation, they are not flying close enough together. to be taking advantage of this upwash, this good air coming off the wingtips. They are flying in a V formation because typically the person at the front is in charge, knows where they're going, knows what they're going to do. And also, if you were to fly in a line during like in World War II, wouldn't go very well when you all started firing your guns. In fact, anyone left would be the one at the end. Everyone else, of course, would get shot out. But many companies are seriously looking, and this video is actually a demonstration video that they were looking to tout to people, of what their plan is. They want to recreate V formation in passenger planes for intercontinental travel. So this example is where a number of planes take off from major airport hubs in Australia, such as Cairns, Brisbane, Canberra, Sydney. And the idea would be that these planes would meet off the east coast of Australia, and they would fly in a V formation across the Pacific and then start peeling off to their respective hubs in the North American sort of region, so Boston, Seattle, New York, Chicago, etc. And the idea being that by doing that, you can, first of all, fly quicker potentially, but most importantly, you would use less fuel. Now, these companies, of course, are thinking money, mainly, that they will save money, but actually it would also be more environmentally friendly as well if you can reduce the fuel consumption. So there's a real vested interest in understanding what aerodynamics and what interactions go on between individuals in a V formation to try and mimic it, to recreate, to save fuel, save money. So this is why people are happy to see this kind of work done and indeed to some extent fund it. So we know there's lots of unanswered questions about V formation flight, and we wanted to try and answer them. Turns out it's quite tricky. We needed two things: some very fancy technology and some birds to work with. Now, thankfully, the technology in the last 5 to 8 years started to present itself in the form of biologging. And what you're looking at here is a series of different biologgers. And what biologgers do is they basically allow us to spy on animals when we can't actually see what they're doing. That may be because they move around so much, because they fly off, because they're diving deep. And what these loggers do is they mean that we can record every aspect of that animal's movement and behaviour 24 hours a day for anything up to 2 years. For example, we can see here we have light level loggers. They can tell us where the animal was depending on day and night cycle. We have GPS loggers. We have depth loggers, tell us of how high an animal flew or how deep an animal dived rather. And we have what we call accelerometry loggers. And these loggers amazingly measure every single movement an animal does up to 300 times a second. So basically you miss nothing. So what this meant was, with these technologies, we could have a GPS logger on a bird, we could have an accelerometry logger on a bird, and that would tell us exactly where each bird was in a V formation and what they were doing 300 times a second in that position. When were they flapping? How hard were they flapping? Why were they moving? When were they moving? So we had the technology to answer this question. What we didn't have at this point was a species to work with, because we had to work with birds who were genuinely flying V formation up there in the sky, hopefully over a migratory flight. And the problem is, if I was to go down to my local park, catch some of the Canada geese, put my loggers on them, they're worth thousands of pounds. When I released my geese, I would wave them off into the distance, and I would probably never see my loggers again. Because for these types of loggers, you have to get them back to get the data off them. They don't transmit, they record. And the opportunity to finally be able to do this work presented itself thanks to this species that you see here. Now, many people think this is an immensely ugly species of bird. I disagree. I think it's very striking. This is the best photo of this bird you will ever see. Excellent lighting, potentially some filters and makeup on there. But the sad thing is, the reason this photo exists is this species, the northern bald ibis, was listed in the top 10 most likely to go extinct by National Geographic. And that's why it had such a fancy photo taken. So this species became functionally extinct in Europe about 250 years ago. Now, I don't like to speak ill of an animal, but it's been tested, and basically they are quite stupid. So to give you an example, they're meant to eat beetles, yet they mistake screws, nails, these kind of things, and they fill their stomachs with that, and they poison themselves and die. They spend a long time trying to probe the ground on astroturf, not realizing it's hard, they're not getting very far. So they're definitely not the most intelligent of species, and this likely contributed to their extinction in Europe. They basically allowed people to walk up to them, pick them up, take them home and cook them, basically. The only populations that persisted were in the Atlas Mountains and a tiny population in Syria. Now, unfortunately, it was confirmed 4 years ago that the Syrian population was intentionally killed during the series of uprisings there, which meant that the only individuals remained in Morocco. Now, the Moroccan population is unusual. It's the only population historically that doesn't migrate. All the other populations migrated. So this fantastic project that was set up in Austria and Germany set about to reintroduce the species into its former European strongholds. And they know from historical records, from anecdotal records, from fossil records, that this species used to breed in Germany and Austria and then migrate to South Italy to winter. But you can imagine there's a huge problem with trying to reintroduce a migratory species back into its former range. How on earth do you teach a 2.5 kilogram bird how to fly from Germany to South Italy? And how they do that is through imprinting the babies on human foster parents. So plenty of these animals persist in zoos. And what they do is they hatch the eggs, and the second that baby comes out of the shell, the first thing it needs to see is the human foster parent. And this process is called imprinting. You see it in species like Ibis, ducks, geese, and swans. And then those human foster parents live with those baby Ibis 24 hours a day for the first 4 months of their life. At which point, as you can see from the pictures, the baby Ibis truly believe the human foster parents are their parents. And what this means is, once those baby Ibis get to the point where they're capable of being able to fly, you get your willing foster parent and you stick them up in a microlight, you ping them up into the air, and the babies start to follow because they don't want to be left behind. And you can tell they're babies here because they've got the grey on their heads rather than the big red and black skin patches. So here we have, in the front is a gentleman called Walter, a good name, who is a very highly skilled microlight pilot. And in the back is an immensely dedicated foster parent who has spent the last 5 months doing nothing but sitting with Ibis. And this lady's called Danielle. And she has a megaphone. And she literally calls to them and they follow her. And we undertake a series of training flights at the site where they've been imprinted to get the birds used to flying. Of course, they need to learn how to fly, but also how to fly together, and then how to fly to follow the microlight. After about 6 to 7 weeks of training, they're ready to migrate because they need to learn this route. They won't survive in Germany in the winter because the ground's too hard. They can't probe. They must get to South Italy. So a huge scale operation involves about 50 to 60 people, a series of camping sites, a series of teams who have to do this migration route with the Ibis. And the route takes us from the German-Austrian border through Austria, through Slovenia, and down into Italy. Now, the only reason that the Alps are avoided is not because the birds would struggle, it's the microlight can't cope with such a mountain range. So that's why it's a slightly convoluted route. But what happens is you set off with your birds, and over a 6 to 8 week period, we flew them from Austria all the way around down into southern Italy. Now, of course, this is perfect because it means that these birds are migrating, they're flying in a V formation way up there in the sky. We can put our loggers on them, and at the end of the day, they come back down to have cuddles with the foster parents, and whilst they're doing that, I can take my loggers off and get all the data that I need. So what did I actually find out from this? Well, I mentioned that historically, people had applied the same logic for aeroplanes to birds who were flapping their wings. which seemed a daft thing to do. However, when we actually looked at the data and did all the same calculations, quite frustratingly, what the birds were doing actually matched fixed wing aerodynamic theory, i.e. what works for aeroplanes. And why that's happening will become clear in a couple of slides' time. So what you can see here is a heat plot. And what this heat plot is showing you is the more red it gets, the more often an individual was in that position. And you can see here between the two individuals that most of the time they spent their time about 45-degree angle out and about 1.8 meters behind. So they clearly had what we call V-favored position. There was obviously an optimal position to be in during this V formation flight, because most of the time that's precisely where they were. What we were surprised about was how much they moved around, because that potentially seemed like a bit of a waste of energy. So what you can see here in the top left is a heat plot which shows the whole flight. Where did individuals spend most of their time? And you can see that actually, rather than being a V, it looks more like a boomerang or sort of a Hawaiian atoll or something like that. But what was fascinating was, you look at these plots on the other side, and the grey shaded area behind each plot is the whole flight, to show the whole flight. Then each of these little heat maps shows you how much each individual moved around that V formation during the flight. What we found was there was individuals who clearly had left or right hand preferences, didn't move too much, and other individuals who just pinged around all over the place for absolutely no apparent reason, and we still don't really know why that is. Something that became apparent during the experiment itself was they had a very distinct social network of individuals who had more friends than others. So one day during a training flight, for example, there was an Ibis that was called Merlin. And we were up there in the sky, we were in various microlights, and we suddenly saw that Merlin had just had enough. He folded up his wings and he went down very quickly and went and sat in a tree. Now, interestingly, we literally saw the other members of the flock. They turned around, they looked at who was going down and was tired and had enough, thought, don't really like him, don't care, and they carried on flying. Now, 3 days later, the same thing happened with another Ibis called Archimedes. And we saw all the other Ibis look, and they went, oh no, not Archimedes, not Archimedes, and they flew down with Archimedes and sat with him until he was ready to continue. So they have a very clear social structure, and as individuals they prefer compared to others, which was quite unexpected. So I mentioned that we were surprised that their positioning matched fixed-wing aeroplane theory, considering they were flapping their wings. So what was going on there? And the next two slides took me months to get my head around, so I will try and explain them, but if it doesn't make total sense, please don't feel bad. It took me a very long time to understand this concept. What the birds were doing in that position is what we call spatial phasing and wingtip path coherence, which is a hell of a mouthful. What it means, to give you an analogy, is to think back when you were a child and it snowed really heavily outside. Now, when you're about 4 or 5, moving through heavy snow is quite tiring. It's a pretty big deal. It's not easy. However, if your parents, who at that point have considerably bigger feet than you, go ahead of you and crunch a path through the snow, your life as a small person is made considerably easier if you then follow that path through the snow, because they've done the hard work for you. You can follow that path. So you're not doing the same thing at the same time as your parents, but what you are doing is the same thing in the same place as your parents, as you follow the same path through the snow. So it turns out this is exactly what birds are doing. When a bird flies through the air, imagine this is a flap cycle, wing up, down, and wing up. This upwash, the good air that's coming off the wingtip, takes exactly the same path through the air as the wingtip does, which makes sense. What that leaves behind that bird is a little path of goodness, a path of helpfulness for the individual behind. And this path of helpfulness basically follows the same path as the wingtip. So what the birds were doing is they were making sure that when they followed the bird in front, their wingtip was doing the same thing at the same time to follow that path. So your front bird has gone flap, 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 flap like this. The upwash behind it is going like this through the air. And the bird that's following makes sure that it does the same thing at the same place to track that upwash. So this requires a huge amount of sensory capacity of which we still don't really understand. So imagine if I said to you, here is a spray can that typically you might go and graffiti with. Obviously, I'm sure you don't, but press it down, run really fast, flapping your arm like a bird. And behind you would be a trail of the color of the spray paint doing this. And it's like your friend trying to run behind you, keeping a distance, but running at the same speed, keeping their little finger in that trail of spray paint that you've left behind. So the birds are working to leave pathways through the air of helpfulness for the birds behind to track and follow. So if we look at a little animation of this, slightly cartoonesque, here we have our lead bird. We might have to watch this a couple of times, flapping away there. And you can see the yellow is the upwash coming off the wingtip. And you can see that the upwash goes like this, following the wingtip through the air. So any bird that wants to take advantage of that upwash has to position itself to make sure that its wingtip is following the same pathway through the air of the bird that it's trying to follow. Now, what's fascinating about this is, as birds move closer and further apart, they update their flapping strategy, if you like, to make sure that wingtip is still following through the air. So it's a really active process. It was previously assumed that this was a passive process, that basically birds just kind of hung around, hoped to find a good sweet spot and then go, okay, I'll stay here for a bit. Turns out it's not the case at all. They're actively tracking this upwash through the air to get benefit and lift from it. And what this diagram shows you is a slightly different way of imagining it. Here we have our lead bird, and the red is the upwash following the path through the air that that wingtip took. So this bird who is following on the bottom right there, based on its position, its wingtip needs to be down at this point because the bird it was following had its wingtip down at that point in space. So this is incredibly intricate, and we still haven't quite figured out how on earth they do that. We tried a whole series of experiments and they all failed abysmally, which is always lovely. So why is this called the good? Well, they're benefiting for a start, but also the take-home story from this graph is that they take it in turns. So after an individual has done a period of time at the front, they swap, they take it in turns, and the next individual does its share. And indeed, if you don't do your share, they remember it days later, and they don't let you track them simply. They try and basically, out of sheer spite, make life tricky for you. So that's why we think of it as good. Everyone's benefiting, and they share the benefits out. One thing that was interesting is no one actually knew how V formation develops in birds. So what this only study from many years ago showed that as birds grow up, they get better at flying in a V. But of course, we had no adults. We had no one to teach them how to fly in a V. We had Danielle in the back of a microlight with a megaphone. And what you can see here in B and C are the very first few flights the Ibis did. And they look like blobs. There's no structure there at all. And it wasn't until about flight 9 that we see here in panel D that they started to separate out and start to resemble, perhaps, more of a V formation. So at this stage, how close are we to applying V formation aerodynamics to planes? We have a way to go. And the problem is pilot error at this point. It's going to have to be a computer that flies in a V formation. Humans is beyond our capacity, and computers are close to getting there. But what this program did, Mythbusters, is it took little planes, it flew them in a V formation, lots of insurance documents filled out before they did this. They flew close enough together to try and capture the upwash. And these planes are trying to fly in a straight plane. And you can see it's not going very well. They can't track the upwash correctly. They basically hit it, miss it, hit it, miss it. And as a result, uncontrollably, they suddenly fly up quite a few meters into the air. So we have some way to go with that. So that's the good side of flying in a V formation. What do I mean about the bad side of flocking? Well, cluster flocking is a very different situation. You can see here two videos that went viral over the last few years. The top one, two girls were out kayaking and the sky went black. They thought it was Armageddon, but it turned out it was a large flock of birds who were cluster flocking over the water. In the bottom video there, you can see a similar situation with starlings, and this is called a murmuration, when starlings come together, up to 1 million individuals that are seemingly acting as one organism. And it's thought they do this to show off to predators for various other aspects. But the aerodynamic feat is incredible, and you can see why they're so popular and they're videoed so often. Now, the largest bird that we can work with, because we have to put blockers on them, the flies in a cluster are pigeons, good old homing pigeons. And I spend a lot of my time working with homing pigeons. And homing pigeons have been used a lot for various studies and for various other slightly less positive aspects. So what you're looking at here, in the top, when Cuba and the US were having their worst relationship, many Americans still wanted Cuban cigars. So people would train homing pigeons to fly from Cuba to the States with a cigar on them. So you'd be sat sunning yourself on a beach in Florida and a pigeon would plop down beside you with a cigar attached to it. It was quite surreal. They've also sadly been used to traffic drugs out of places like Colombia and other countries. The sad thing there is the border people know that and just shoot them now. And many pigeons have even won medals for the efforts they had in World War I or World War II, when they were flown for reconnaissance missions with these highly unobtrusive cameras attached to them, which I'm sure no one noticed. And indeed, one pigeon, Xiaomi, actually saved hundreds of lives, if not thousands, with the information that she brought back. She got shot in the eye, her leg was shot off, yet she still got up, carried on, and the message she relayed saved, I think it's around 800 soldiers' lives. So they played a huge role in the war. What that told us is, though, they're quite capable of flying with a small logger attached to them. That was a benefit for us. And one study that had been done previously, and don't worry about the graph too much, but what the study showed is that flying in a cluster is the opposite of flying in a V formation. It comes at a cost. It actually costs you energy to fly in a cluster. And that cost is increased the closer you get to another individual or the further towards the back you get of the flock. And the way to think of this, imagine you've been queuing up all day at a festival or a concert, and you're right at the front, and that barrier goes up, and between you and the front of the stage is nothing apart from a field. And you can run as fast as you like, you can take whatever route you like to get there because you don't have to worry about anyone else. However, if you're in the middle, you're constantly cautious about not hitting other people. And it's the same for birds in a cluster flock. Those at the front can do what they like. There's nothing in front of them. Those at the back and in the middle are constantly having to avoid collisions. They've got all this air coming at them. They can't see because there's pigeons, pigeons, pigeons. So it's much harder for them to work in a cluster. Now, this previous study, there was using loggers, and what it showed was that flying in a cluster comes at a cost, individuals at the back, or when you're very close to another bird. But this study, we only did flying in circles over their home loft. And what you can see here in this animation, two trailblazing pigeons that took off first, and the rest of the flock go and join them there. And they're flying around largely in a circle. And it's a slightly artificial situation. So the next thing we wanted to know was what happens when we fly them over longer distances. Now, I won't go into sort of too much detail about pigeon homing, but we know they use smell, they use the Earth's magnetic field, they use landmarks, they use a compass. They have an amazing array of mechanisms they use to find their way home. But we weren't sure how individuals all work together in a cluster to get home. Are all the individuals contributing equally? We didn't know. So we wanted to mimic our V formation study in cluster flocking pigeons over longer distances. And we did this by flying them 188 times from a release site, which is up in the top right of that map, to their home loft, which is in the bottom left. And what you can see is 3 traces. The blue trace was around flight 15, 16. They're still finding their way. The red trace was around flight 25, getting better. And they suddenly hit the point in the yellow trace where their flight becomes super direct. When we very first released them, they would take hours and hours and hours to come back. By the end, it was 11 minutes. So they really streamlined that process. We actually thought we had alcoholic pigeons because they kept going via all these country pubs. But that's because where this was done in Hertfordshire, those country pubs are old, very large houses, which are quite good landmarks. So the pigeons were using them to get home before they streamlined their process. And in fact, one night when it snowed, none of our pigeons came back. I lost 20 pigeons with £20,000 worth of equipment. I rang round the pubs, and sure enough, they were stuck in a tree or roosting in a tree in one of the pub gardens. I could go and retrieve them the next day. But we flew them 188 times from this release site, expecting to find a similar result perhaps to V formation. They all take it in turns. Because if flying at the back comes at a cost, it's pretty mean to keep the same individuals at the back the whole time, because they're going to be working harder every flight. So what did we find? Well, we found that Pigeon Society is the opposite of Ibis Society. What you can see here in the bottom left under panel B is a heat plot for a cluster flight. You can see just how close together they all are. It's an incoherent blob. When you look at the 2 panels here, C and D, the grey shaded area is the heat plot for the whole flight. And you can see that this individual spent the entire flight in the front half. This individual spent the entire flight in the back half. And we mimicked this, or rather we found this for every one of those flights. The same individuals were in the front having an easy, happy time. The same individuals were stuck at the back having a rough time, working considerably harder. They don't take it in turns at all. It's a very selfish society. One unexpected side effect of this was, at this point, we'd only ever flown them as a group. The very first time I flew them on their own, something quite shocking happened. What you can see here, at the top right, release site, bottom left, homing flight. And these red traces are those birds that spent all their time in the front of the flock. They had clearly learnt the route, no problem. They came home in the same time. On the right-hand side, with the blue traces, are those birds who spent all their time at the back of the flock. And what you can see there is they had not learnt the route at all. Despite flying it 188 times, they had been mere passengers. Some of them were so bad, they took nearly 19 days to come home, as opposed to 11 minutes. And you can see from some of these traces, they simply gave up, so the loggers run out after 24 hours. So this felt very strange. A species famous for its amazing homing was failing abysmally to come home. It had merely been a passenger. So we redid the study from another site, and we found exactly the same thing. The same individuals in the front, the same individuals in the back, and those poor individuals in the back had never learnt the route. Some of them flew around for hours looking for their friends. One of these flew around for a whopping 1 minute before sitting still for 18 hours. Others even tried to join another pigeon and fly around for a bit before both realising neither of them knew what they were doing. All birds came back eventually, but clearly there's a learning impact of being stuck at the back. So you work harder and you can't see what you're doing. So what on earth could be doing this? What's dictating this? Well, it turns out it's all to do with what happens to you when you're a young pigeon. What you're looking at here is a triangle is where the pigeons live, and the square is a release site just 1 kilometre away. When they're young, I would take them out and release them. And you can see on their own, they were flying solo, a big difference between their initial ability to find their way home. Blue, green and red flew back within minutes, a nice direct flight. Yellow, black and brown took up to 24 hours to fly home. Indeed, their loggers stopped working after about 20 hours. And you can see that at one point when the loggers failed, they'd actually flown off into the town. And in fact, one of them was sat on the roof of the Chinese, and the other one had gone via Thorpe Park and actually sat on a frame of the roller coaster for a period of time. So it seems like there may be a link between your initial abilities as a baby and whether you end up at the front or back of a flock. And I confirmed this through a series of laboratory experiments where I tested how willing individuals were to explore a novel environment, how willing they were to go off and look around their local area. Some individuals, you release them, they go in a circle, straight back in the loft. Others, you release them and they go and explore for 6-7 hours. Those individuals are the ones that home quicker, and those individuals are the ones that fly at the front of the flock. So it seems like your personality when you're young dictates whether the rest of your life in a cluster flock you're having a good time at the front or a really hideous bad time at the back. So just to finish with very quickly, why do I call it the ugly? I don't think they're ugly, but many other people do. These are the most amazing animals. Hopefully you may be familiar with them. They're naked mole-rats. And naked mole-rats are an enigma to science for so many reasons. Firstly, they are eusocial mammals. They're one of only 2 species that are eusocial. And that means they live like wasps, bees, and ants. You have a queen, you have princes, you have workers. They have a eusocial society where only one individual breeds and the rest have their various jobs to do. They live underground, basically virtually never seeing daylight, apart from princesses who once a year go up to start their own colony. They can use cellulose and they don't have to even breathe with oxygen. They have an immensely high carbon dioxide tolerance. They can live for 30 years, despite being the size of a domestic hamster. They are seemingly immune to cancer, and they don't experience muscle wastage as they age. So they are intensely being studied at the moment for that reason. But my bizarre interest in them, and as Walter alluded to, I like to work with slightly strange animals, is they have a unique ability of running backwards in the same way that they run forwards. That doesn't sound impressive until you imagine what most animals look like trying to run backwards. Imagine a horse running backwards, a cat every now and again at Christmas, I'm wrapping presents, a bit of sellotape gets on my cat's nose, it tries to go backwards, it doesn't go very well. So this is what they look like when they're running backwards, little sort of sausages with teeth. And the reason we're interested in this is they may have applications to robotics and artificial intelligence. And what's amazing about this ability to run backwards is it's right there from when they're babies. It's a tiny baby, and there it is. They're perfectly capable of running backwards. But what's interesting about the running backwards is, yes, they can do it, but they would still rather run forwards because it's faster. If you're being chased by a snake in your burrow, not to get away quickly. So forwards is quicker than backwards. So we know that the queen is in charge of everything, basically. And then what we did is we found a distinct dominance hierarchy between colonies. You had the queen who was the most dominant down here, and then you had the other members who gradually went from one down to other dominance ranks. And we found that actually the more dominant you are, the less you run backwards. So they don't want to run backwards, and if you're in charge, you point blank refuse. Now, interestingly, these little individuals here in the orange are the sweepers. They're the ones that go around the tunnels, keeping them clean, keeping them clear. And even the queen will let them go about their business and get out the way because they appreciate the value and the job that those workers are doing. So the workers who are the most sort of low ranked don't have to go backwards because the others want them to keep cleaning and keep their tunnels clear. So they're a really bizarre system, and this is early work we've been doing with them. I just wanted to include that at the end because I find them amazing. So do feel free to go away and read more about them. And with that, there's a very long list of acknowledgements there that I won't go through. I shall now stop talking and thank you all very much for listening.